Right, so welcome to another episode of Cricket Cards on YouTube. So today we're going to be focusing on the 28 greatest Don Bradman cards spanning 1928 through to 2017. So maybe if we begin with kind of a little bit of Bradman 101. So kind of outside of the US, he's generally considered as the GOAT of GOATs, mainly due to the sheer margin between first and second place when it comes to the greatest cricketer of all time. So maybe to provide you with a little bit of a sense of what he was like. There's many stories, but one of the stories is of a bowler called Bill Black from 1931. So Bradman would have been 22. And Bradman came in to bat against him and kind of turned to the wicketkeeper. So this would be, in baseball, this would be the catcher. And he asked him, hey, is this guy any good? And he's like, don't you recognize him? He's been telling everyone for the last 3 weeks about how he bowled you out the other month. And Bradman's like, is that so? So over the next 22 balls, he made 100 runs. And then he went on to feed Bill Black's team 256 runs. So maybe to put that into perspective, we can use a measuring stick of what kind of happened in the World Cup recently. So there's a player called Glenn Maxwell. He scored 100 runs off 40 balls. And that became the world record for the quickest 100 to be hit. And that kind of overtook the previous one, which took 49 balls. So even though it definitely wasn't the same level of competition, you can see just kind of how good Don Bradman was there. This kind of argument, it crosses all sports. It's a generational argument. My era is better than your era. The guys that played during our time were tougher than your time. And this is really the best response that I've ever seen to this. So Tendulkar asked him, he said, Sir Don, if you were to play today, what would have you averaged? And he said, probably about 70. Now, keep in mind that Don Bradman averaged 99.94. And Tendulkar, who's really, as I touched on previously, thought to be the second best, averaged 53.78. So even 70 was kind of way better than what Tendulkar was averaging at his prime. And so Tendulkar responded with, well, why not 100? And Bradman was like, wow, it's not bad for a 90-year-old. You see, so he was always in control. He was always one step ahead and always competitive. And then if we kind of look at that scoring record again, probably the best way to frame it would be something like what Wilt Chamberlain did in the 61-62 season, averaging 50.4 points per game. And then what you do is you take that and you stretch that over 20 years. So imagine Wilt scored that every season for 20 years with a war in the middle. And then the second best after that is Michael Jordan at 30.1. But then, of course, you have to be a winner, and Bill Russell embodies that better than any. And Bradman had a team, in fact, called the Invincibles. One of the stories around that team was in 1948, Mahatma Gandhi's son really wanted to see Bradman play, and when he turned up, there were no hotels, there was nowhere that he could stay, and he actually convinced the local jail to open up a bed for him. And so he stayed the night in jail and then went to see Bradman play the other day. And Bradman's always had a really special place in the heart of Indians. So one of those reasons was, very much that he was seen as a beater of the colonial oppressors. And actually in 1932, Bradman made it to America. They played kind of an exhibition series of matches that spanned from Canada all the way through New York and ended up in California. And during that journey, Bradman and Babe Ruth managed to spend some time together. In fact, he went with Babe Ruth to watch one of the Yankees matches when Babe Ruth was injured. There are some interesting things that happened on that trip outside of Bradman and Babe Ruth getting to know each other. Ruth was kind of 13 years older than Bradman, so he was kind of in the twilight of his career, and Bradman was kind of really in the heyday of his. And so during that trip in New York, Bradman went out for zero. And in cricket, a zero is called a duck. And the story goes that somehow Donald Bradman, going out for a duck, made it to Walt Disney. Walt hung around with many of the people that were part of the Hollywood Cricket Club, which the Bradman's team ended up playing their final matches against, and they had many actors, and Boris Karloff, who played Frankenstein's monster, was a wicketkeeper, and things like that. So in 1931, Disney wrote The Adventures of Mickey Mouse, which featured a duck called Donald in it. So he kind of already had the name, but now it's been written in many places that that duck in New York was responsible for the creation of Donald Duck. But I don't think so. I think it kind of helped to encourage him to create the character Donald Duck, because he realized that there was another person who's probably the most famous person in the world outside of America, and he was called Donald. And so, I think that possibly spawned that, and maybe something that leads credence to that as well is this image here that was probably produced maybe a year after the Wise Little Hen, which was Donald Duck's first appearance in 1934. And I mean, they're playing cricket, but that's not really the interesting part. The interesting part is a scoreboard with zeros, which are ducks, and so that would indicate that, to me at least, that maybe it's a little Easter egg from Disney. And then there's kind of other stories. Of course, you've got maybe a similar experience to what happened with the Dream Team between Michael Jordan and Isaiah Thomas, or didn't happen there. And you've got the same thing with Bradman, individual called Keith Miller. So their personalities were just incredibly different. So Keith Miller really was a socialite and loved cricket. He just really played it with a lot of joy, and Bradman just wanted to win and enjoyed it, but he was about winning, period. And so this kind of misaligned them. Keith Miller would be going out when they're on tour in England, and he'd be seen out partying to late with Princess Margaret, Queen Elizabeth's sister. And then, during the war, he was a fighter pilot and he flew alongside the Brits. And so, he when the Ashes rekindled, he was just looking to enjoy himself, and he could do that and be a great player. But you see, there was a lot of history there that Keith Miller had missed, because he was too young for this. But in 1932, there's a series called the Bodyline series. It was called the Ashes, but been referred to as the Bodyline series. And so maybe one way to look at this is that in baseball, you don't pitch the ball at the batter's body line. If you do, he's probably going to rush them out and try and knock you out. So it's just something you don't do. And the same in cricket. At the time, it was not illegal to bowl at the batsman's body. It was just not seen as gentlemanly to do that. So you just wouldn't do it. But Bradman had beat the English team so badly in the prior Ashes that they had to do something different, and so they decided to bowl at his body. And so you can imagine this from a period of like December 2nd, 1932 through to February 28th, 1933. I mean, literally hundreds of times they just threw the ball at his body. And you can imagine, you got in baseball, you throw it once, he's rushing the mound. You do that hundreds of times, is not going to forget that. And I think that was the big chip that Bradman had, that made him, kind of led to some of these quotes at the bottom here. So we've got, if you don't give an Englishman an inch, you play them tough all the way and grind them into the dust. That's very counter to what Keith Miller's thoughts were. And so the next Ashes series, Keith wasn't picked, and Bradman was part of that selection committee. Bradman said he had just one voice and he didn't have a decision in that, but maybe that's one of the things that kind of impacted the relationship moving forward. And I love this picture because it's, they clearly respected each other in the end. They just went about their craft in very, very different ways. All right, so I hope that's been helpful, giving you a little bit of a sense of what Bradman was like. So let's jump into it. As usual, kind of your general best guess rarity scale. Right. So maybe a little bit of housekeeping just to start with. This is purely subjective, and it's just my thoughts on which cards are my favorite. But generally speaking, I would say probably the top 5 or 7 are probably going to be quite similar with most. But then outside of that, it's really going to be completely different. So maybe another thing to touch on as well is that I'm treating all these cards like they're ungraded, and they're just the most common condition of that card. So this is reasonable for most of the cards. However, there's a couple of cards early on that the grade actually really impacts the value far more than any of the cards probably outside of the top 5 or 6. So those cards could easily jump into the top 10. But because I'm just treating them as raw and the kind of most common condition, cards like those kind of possibly get treated a little unfairly. So coming in at number 28 is the 1939. This is an interesting one because it's definitely oversized for the cards of the day. So it's much larger than a cigarette or confectionery card, but it's slightly smaller than kind of the typical size that we see today. Now these are some of Bradman's more recent cards. On the left we have his Topps Gold one. It's not numbered, but there were 140 produced when you look at the pack odds and the number of boxes created. And then we have the Futera card. This is his first redemption. Again, unnumbered, but the redemption cards are numbered. This is a 1932 Hoadley's Empire Games card. In my opinion, probably one of the best looking vintage cards out there. Decently rare, but they're available, but have definitely become more scarce over time. This is one of the cards that's kind of tricky. There's a lot of collectors that will place this far higher. If this was in kind of its average grade, might be a 2.5, 3 PSA. That then probably very much deserves to be here. And it's also punching because all the cards that follow are much rarer than this. But then if you move it up to kind of like a 6 or so, now it starts to kind of really start to jump up the table there, at least in value. And it's also a very important card. This is one of his rookie cards. So yeah, I think maybe unfairly so. These two cards are number 23 and 24. Okay, now this is a really interesting set. It's kind of tricky to know exactly how many cards are in the set because they share so many of the same front images. It's just the back numbering, sometimes the copy as well that's different. So there's thought to be 39 of them, but they are decently rare. All right, so now on to number 21. So this is Bradman's first product auto. You'd buy it actually in a set. This is a little tricky, this set, in line with what we typically expect from Futera, but it's not Futera at its best. And Futera at its best is its worst, if that makes sense. If you collect Futera, you know what that means. So this kind of came in different kinds of boxes. You got them in folders, you got them in plastic containers, lovely wooden boxes. I think it was the first 50 that came in the wooden boxes. And then you also have a player's set, and that's unnumbered, but there's meant to be 200 of those. But the interesting thing about this set is that the story goes that when Keith Miller found out that Bradman was part of it, he refused to sign his cards. I don't know that that's really the truth behind it, but whatever the truth is, Keith only signed 100 of his cards spread across both the player set and the numbered set. So where this becomes really quite interesting is when you have the set that includes the Keith Miller autograph. That's really the chase one, although the others, the sets without the Keith Miller are very desirable. The Keith Miller card in that is really what makes it. Number 20. This is a really nice looking card. A wonderful font on the back. So it's a 1933 McRobertson. So it's a very rare card, but on top of that, it's super scarce. Although 2 just popped up on eBay the other month, which was kind of unusual. But why it's scarce is that it also has, I think there's 72 cards in the set, but 12 of them are VFL players. So we had the VFL, and that moved in to become the AFL, which is our Australian Football League, and it's Aussie rules football, not soccer. So really, what this means is that you've got 2 different kinds of sports collectors going after the same cards. Right, now we start to level things up to the rarest level. So this is the 1936 All Sports Black Crows card. There's, I think, 3 different back variations. Some of them reasonably rare, but this is the rarest of all of those variations. Now we move on to number 18, 1930 Plum Ridges confectionery card. I think there's maybe 4 different back variations of this. There's quite a few. But it's a great card. It's his kind of 2nd or 3rd year card, so very highly desired by collectors. Okay, so now we're coming into, I guess, the Bradman Ultra Modern. So most recently we have the tap and play cards. So these are cut autographs. There's 3 different variations of 1-of-1s from this set. Then we have the Sport Kings from 2013, which is an American manufacturer. This is his 1-of-1 from that. It's a cut autograph again. So, obviously as rare as you can get because they're one of ones. But some people you could probably put these cards higher, but I find it quite difficult because the ones that are higher are redemptions that are on card auto, and they're just incredibly rare. So I just find it tricky to put these with those numbered cards. So, but great cards. Now this is the typical style of Futera. You have these which are numbered to 50. They're super desirable. You also have sample cards, and there's thought to be about 50 of those that are signed and stamped authentic. We have promotional cards, and those are hand numbered to 30. So then we kind of move to the one in the top right, and you may recall this from the heritage set from earlier. Now this is slightly different in that it has a gold authentic autograph stamp on it. This is again a little confusing because I've seen these with both a promotional card written on the back and then also without it, and they're meant to be 6 with the promotional card written on the back. So I put these, even though they're very rare, I place them here because the promotional card printed on the back kind of looks, it really covers the back. Doesn't look that great, but there has to be collectors that would put this higher as well. So, but that's kind of where it falls for me. Right, now we move on to kind of a second year Bradman card. The Morrows card, it's a great card, super scarce, but what I've done is I've actually put the following year Morrows ahead of this one, and they come in at number 6 and 7. So this is 1930-31 Morrows cricketers cards. These are slightly oversized. I find the imagery far nicer than the other card, and yeah, so probably about as rare, maybe a touch rare. I'm not sure because they're just at that stage where they just rarely come up. And then now we start to move up again. So we looked at this card earlier. This was the 1993 redemption card, so Bradman's first redemption. But what they did is they, in effect, bought back a bunch of them, and then they had Bradman sign them, put an authentic autograph stamp on, and they auctioned them off for charity. Now, that happened in 1996. I think there's meant to be about 10 of those that were auctioned off. So these are kind of hugely desirable. And you can definitely switch number 4 and number 5 all day long. It's definitely a personal preference there. And we have number 4. And so as I mentioned before, some collectors might pop this to number 5. But for me, it's number 4. Bradman only had one autograph redemption card. This is the only card that you could get in packs. The rest were either auctioned off or they were part of a set. So you'd buy a set of 500, like the Heritage, or you buy a set of 4, which were those platinum cards. Or those in that set, you sometimes didn't know if you'd get an autograph as part of it or not. But yeah, this is the only redemption. One of the amazing things about this as well is this is in Futera, this is Select. Select is still going strong, and they honor their redemptions, as you should. Very similar to what we're seeing now with Fanatics and what they're doing with Topps. And so at least I know they honored them up to last year. And I think at the time I heard from someone that there was 38 that had been redeemed. So it's a great card, and so it's obviously one of my favorite cards. So let's get into the ultra heavies. So then we have number 2 and 3, and I don't know which one's which really. At least for me, we've got the 1928 Hoadleys. This comes in 2-back variations, although kind of very minimal. It's just the font is flipped. So we have the 12-6 and the 6-12. So you have the Hoadleys on the left or Hoadleys on the right. And this is Bradman's very first cricket card. So there's actually 2 Bradman cards that were produced in 1928 for the Ashes series. You've got this one, and then shortly after you've got the Ogdens. And then in 1929, there was the Wills and the McNivens that were produced again for the same series. Now, with the McNivens, you've got 2-back variations, slightly more different than what you saw with the Hoadleys. You've got the toffee bar and the Pepsin tube. So I think it's just for me at least, it's really tricky to split both of these cards. I like them both equally, and so this is kind of where they find themselves. Now, on to the number 1. This is from Hobart, Tasmania. This is a 1935 Sugar Products card. So we've actually done a whole presentation about the cards from this set. So I'm going to leave it for you to find out more about this card from that presentation. So I hope this has been informative. And as usual, if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out. All right, cheers.